So this runway in Suriname might look ordinary, but in 1980 it became ground zero for a secret Cold War crisis that would reshape American covert operations for decades to come. Now I know because I was there. Well, technically not during the crisis itself, but 5 years later as a 10-year-old, our backyard literally shared a fence with the dictator's compound. His name was Desi Bouterza, and the neighbors called him Desi or Bauta. I used to have a playhouse in my backyard where I would climb up on the roof and I had a spy telescope and I would peer over his backyard and there was a black panther that would pace back and forth. And they'd have shards of glass that would be embedded at the top of the brick fence. And on the other sides of the shards of fence were these dictators, not these dictators, they were these teenagers that had Uzi submachine guns, which I thought was pretty cool because I'd only seen those before in Miami Vice. Meanwhile, this isn't just my story, though. This is how a tiny South American nation, it was a former Dutch colony that was rich in bauxite, which is the ore that they used to make aluminum, which was really important, especially during World War II, because it seems like everything was made out of aluminum back then. But this country became the testing ground for what would later be called Project Democracy, which is Ronald Reagan's blueprint for changing out regimes, overthrowing countries that he thought were a communist threat. So let's back up a little bit. February 25th, 1980, just 5 years after independence, Suriname was in major chaos. There were 16 non-commissioned officers led by Bouterza, who was then just kind of a chicken farmer, former basketball star, and had just returned to South America after independence to help kind of drain the swamp of Suriname. And he launched what became known as the Sergeant's Coup. But when they seized power and took the capital, there was two specialized American aircraft that were sitting on the tarmac at Xander J. I always mix that up. I think it's man. Anyways, they changed the name. I think it's Johan Pengel Airport now. Anyways, my Dutch got really bad after I left Suriname. But the crews, there were 26 American crew members that were stuck at their hotel while Bouterza's troops threatened to shoot if the planes were moved. Now, these weren't ordinary planes. They were EC-135Ns, Arias. They had these 7-foot antenna dishes housed in these. They look like an alcoholic's nose. They call them a drop snoot nose cones, which were designed to track space missions and gather intelligence. They would cost about a $4.5 million back then, about $16 million today. But they weren't the famous doomsday planes. If you've ever watched those movies where they get the president on the plane because of a nuclear attack, and that's called the doomsday plane. This wasn't exactly that plane, but it was like a cousin to that plane. Those planes were designed to keep the president alive during nuclear war. These planes were critical components in America's nuclear command infrastructure. So, according to Deputy Chief, I wrote it down so I wouldn't get this wrong, but I'm still going to butcher it, Noel Pazdral, the standoff was resolved through his direct negotiations with Bouterza, who personally ensured the safety of the crew that was traveling out to the airport. Bouterza had actually received training with NATO back in the Netherlands, and so he understands it's not a good idea to pick a fight with America the first day of your job as dictator of the new country. Well, bigger fish to fry. But the damage was done. They had exposed a massive blind spot in U.S. national security, and specifically 3 critical weaknesses in American security planning. So first, you had an intelligence vacuum. So Suriname had been considered pretty stable for the U.S., that they really didn't even bother having much of an embassy down there. They didn't even have a CIA station chief at the time. So overnight, a strategic hub had fallen to a couple of sergeants where nobody really understood their ideologies. A lot of people believed differently. What did Bouterza believe? He had this leftist contingency in there. What do they stand for? Are they going to continue the treaties? All these questions were unanswered, and they didn't have good answers because they didn't have intelligence. Secondly, they had a more terrifying question to deal with, which was, what happens if a nuclear crisis erupts and you actually had a president or their successors needing to land a plane, and they had landed in a country like a Suriname, and now they can't get out because 16 NCOs had taken over the country. That's a bigger problem. Finally, they had another flaw, which is like America had this thing called a federal arc, which was like a ring of hardened command centers. So think bunkers built during the Eisenhower era that were all now vulnerable to Soviet targeting. Part of what they were using these airplanes for was to recover satellite footage that was in the Azores, where they had this wide awake field where they used to eject satellite canisters and then they would retrieve them, and then they need to have a place to land. But the timing just couldn't have been worse, right? So a couple weeks later, March 14th, 1980, America's warning system detected what appeared to be Soviet missiles that were targeting North America. Now, it proved to be a false alarm, but it came so soon after the Suriname incident that it triggered a national security overhaul. And this is where President Carter at the time got directly involved, and they responded with unprecedented speed. So within 4 months, the president personally authorized a radical new approach to dealing with nuclear survival. So Operation Treetop came first. This was abandoned the old, like, let's have a fixed bunker somewhere model, and instead it created this mobile teams that would accompany the president's successors to these random, unprepared locations, creating uncertainty that would actually protect them against Soviets being able to target them and make them easy to find, right? So in May of 1980, Carter ordered Exercise 9 Lives. Now, this was the first comprehensive test of dispersing presidential successors, including like helicopter evacuations and communication systems between multiple hidden command locations. And by June, Carter had signed Presidential Directive 58. So this fundamentally reimagined how government would function during a nuclear war.